Good evening once again. I'm Stephanie Rule. The twice impeached ex-president is bracing for what could be an explosive confrontation with lawmakers investigating January 6th. The House Select Committee is said to be on the verge of sending Donald J. Trump that subpoena for records and testimony. The vote to take that step was exactly 1 week ago tonight. The Washington Post reporting this. Lawmakers and committee lawyers spent the last days since last week's hearing carefully crafting the subpoena language, closely studying case law about subpoenas to current and former presidents. Tonight, committee member Zoe Lofgren confirmed that, saying the subpoena would be issued very soon, and she says much of the focus is on the paperwork.
The documents may be even more important than his live testimony. We do know that the former president has a veracity problem. We've gotten a lot of documents from the archives, but there's more that we would like to have.
Politico reporting Trump is lawyering up yet again. He has hired another lawyer, conservative attorney Harmeet Dillon, to negotiate with the panel. She's represented several witnesses who have already appeared before the committee, including Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. Tomorrow, one-time Trump strategist and longtime friend Steve Bannon, who refused to comply with a subpoena, will learn his punishment for contempt of Congress. Prosecutors asking for the maximum sentence of 6 months in prison and a $200,000 fine. According to The Guardian, Bannon plans to ask a federal appeals court to overturn the conviction. And tonight, there are new developments in the Mar-A-Lago documents case. According to a new letter sent to the special master, Trump is now claiming at least 9 documents seized by the FBI are his personal property. But the Justice Department argues these documents involve pardons and immigration policies, and they are covered by the Presidential Records Act, and they belong in the National Archives. There's also major news in Georgia and their investigation into Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election results in that state. NBC News confirming Trump's former White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, has testified to the grand jury in that case. And today, a federal appeals court said South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham must testify before that very same grand jury. Graham filed a lawsuit to try to avoid the subpoena, but 2 separate courts have now rejected his arguments. Prosecutors are focusing on Graham's phone call with Georgia's top election officials just days after the 2020 vote. With that, let's get smarter tonight with the help of our leadoff panel. Michelle Sindor joins us, NBC News correspondent and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. Katie Benner's here, Pulitzer Prize-winning Justice Department reporter for the New York Times, and Neil Katyal, Department of Justice veteran and former acting Solicitor General during the Obama administration. He has argued dozens of cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Katie, let's turn to you. This subpoena, the anticipation for it grows by the day. It's like the rose ceremony in The Bachelor at this point. How close are we to getting this thing?
I think that Zoe Lofgren was telling the truth, of course, when she said they are very close. They needed to be extremely careful with the subpoena, as you can imagine. And they also needed to weigh the risks about the subpoena. I mean, soon after they said that they were going to ask Donald Trump for testimony and documents, you saw that he put out a 14-page screed filled with lies about the election, and it really illustrated the risk there is in getting Donald Trump to testify, which is one of the reasons why, as Congresswoman Lofgren said, they're very, very focused on documents in addition to his testimony. This is a high-risk move that the committee has taken, so they were being as careful as possible as they craft the subpoena, and then we'll wait and see what happens with Donald Trump.
Neil, let's talk about the language in the subpoena and why it's so important, because given history as a guide, whatever it says, Trump's going to blow his nose with it and throw it in the garbage.
That's 100% right. And so here he's got all sorts of claims we've started to see about attorney-client privilege, executive privilege. They've always been bogus, but if you're a member of Congress trying to craft a subpoena, you got to be very careful. I mean, look at just what Trump's doing in Mar-A-Lago before Judge Deary, the special master. He's arguing that the documents are personal to him, and therefore the investigators can't have them. And at the same time, he's claiming executive privilege over those documents, which means they're, of course, not personal to him. So Trump's legal team has now invented, I guess, the legal equivalent of Schrodinger's document documents. So long as the papers are hidden in Donald Trump's Mar-A-Lago desk, they're simultaneously government documents and non-government documents. I mean, this kind of inanity is what Congress has to deal with as they craft this subpoena. And I hope one other thing, Steph, as they craft the subpoena for Trump, and Trump's obviously important, he's the key figure, but his second figure is Vice President Pence. And it is, still to me baffling and inexcusable that this January 6th committee, which has done such a phenomenal job marshaling the evidence, telling the story of what actually happened to the American people, but there's a huge piece missing, which is Pence. His aides have testified, he's let them testify, but he so far has been afraid to, and I think Congress should call his bluff.
Neil, you mentioned the Mar-a-Lago documents case and Trump's new claims. No, these documents are mine. How's the special master going to rule on this? Are Trump's arguments nonsense? Is he just trying to run the clock? What's he doing?
Yeah, I mean, nonsense is actually putting it charitably. These arguments are going nowhere. He doesn't have any valid claim for at least the documents that the Justice Department really cares about. Now, I suppose in the search, they probably did take some personal documents, because one of the things you try and do as an investigator is show that Trump actually knew that these documents were there. And so if it's, if the classified and sensitive documents are with some of his other papers that he accesses, that's a way of demonstrating that. But of course, there's filter teams and all sorts of ways to protect privacy in that circumstance. So I don't think the special master is going anywhere, which is why, nobody ever else gets a special master, really. I mean, it's an incredibly rare thing. But Trump found a judge who gave him one. But be careful what you wish for, because this special master so far has been just, pretty hostile to Trump's claims.
Yamiche, let's talk about Trump's new lawyer. Well-known conservative lawyer. You may have seen her on Fox News. She specializes in defending a lot of these people who claim election fraud, falsely claim it. What can we expect here?
Well, what we can expect is a lawyer who's going to try to do a good job on behalf of former President Trump, but who's going to continue to have a client who is trying to dictate for himself what the legal strategy should be. Katie just talked about this idea of former President Trump sending this 14-page memo. I read that and I literally was like, who in the world allowed him to clearly dictate all of this to send to the committee? The first line was literally in all caps, Stephanie. And I think in some ways it reminds us that while President Trump can have the means to hire high-powered lawyers and have the means to hire lawyers that might be able to come up with a strategy that could win, he's still himself going to have a really troubled relationship with the truth. And as a result, you're going to have people who are trying to steer him in one direction and he's going to go in another. And that, of course, is the story of Donald Trump in the White House, outside of the White House, before the White House. So I think, yes, we can see a lawyer who's going to try to do her best here, but it's still going to be a very, very challenging case.
Neil, let's talk about Kash Patel, because when you look at the cadre of Trump allies who are willing to say anything, do anything, perform as a human shield for him, Kash Patel is high on the list. And now it has been reported, former Trump Pentagon aide, he's now testified to the grand jury in the classified documents case. And I want to share with you Andrew Weissman's take on that.
The fact that he's being put in, to me, signals that the prosecutors definitely have Donald Trump as a target, and that is where they're going. Kash Patel was the person who, in May and June, had made statements saying that Donald Trump had done this sort of spontaneous, miraculous declassification of documents when things were moved from the Oval Office to the residence. They spontaneously just became
the immaculate declassification.
Exactly. Yes. So you can be sure they're going to ask about that, which is, we want to know, is that a possible defense?
What do you think?
So two things. One, Andrew's absolutely right that this is further evidence that Donald Trump is the target of a federal investigation. I don't think we needed Kash Patel basically to tell us that. I mean, after all, Trump's Mar-a-Lago property has been, searched pursuant to a federal warrant, and a federal judge has signed off saying there's probable cause to believe that evidence at Mar-a-Lago shows crimes will bear on whether crimes were committed. So, this is not surprising news. The part that I think should cause Trump some worry is this. It's one thing for Kash Patel to go mouth off on Fox News about, someone declassifying documents in their head or whatever other nonsense. But it's a very different thing to make those claims under penalty of perjury before a federal grand jury. And it wouldn't shock shock me if Kash Patel all of a sudden today, before the grand jury, started recalling a very different version of events than what he's going around and telling Fox News.
But isn't that distressing? A grand jury, a small group of people, they get to hear the truth. But when you sit on set at Fox News, you can just use their megaphone to amplify lies to millions and millions of viewers with no consequences. Katie, here's something else concerning for the Justice Department. They're now saying they need more cash to continue the Jan 6th investigation. That ain't happening if Republicans win in November. So if that ends up being the case, what happens to all the evidence they've gathered so far?
What will happen is the Justice Department will have to try to move money around within the department. And this does not mean that the investigation will end simply because Congress does not appropriate as much money as the Justice Department would like. It just simply means that the Justice Department overall will not have the money it wants to operate at the capacity that it wants everywhere. So you could see cuts being made in other places. You can see resources being moved around at the FBI and other investigative bodies in order to accommodate needs for something as important as the January 6th investigation. I don't think that Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco, the top two officials, are going to say, we're going to simply let this go because of appropriations. But to your point, Congress does have a lot of power. It has the purse strings, and that is how it can control what the agencies are doing, or how it can curb what the agencies are doing.
It all depends on who has control in Congress. Neil, let's talk Lindsey Graham. He tried again, but he has now lost in his repeated attempts to avoid testifying in Georgia. What happens next? Will he continue to fight, or Lindsey got to show up and talk?
He can try and take this to the Supreme Court, but it's a loser. So the Court of Appeals basically said to Lindsey Graham, you got to play by the same rules that every other American does, that if you have a subpoena to testify before a grand jury, you can't just blow it off. You got to actually do it. And this has become, in Georgia, a very serious criminal investigation, made even more serious yesterday because a federal judge in California, David Carter, released some emails showing that Trump, it sure looks like these emails show that Trump intentionally lied about the vote counts in Georgia to a court under penalty of perjury. So the investigation's serious, and what Lindsey Graham has been trying to do is block, and he's afraid to go testify and tell the truth before a grand jury, and he's asserting a constitutional privilege. Now, I once wrote a Harvard Law Review article about that privilege. It's called the speech or debate privilege, and I can tell you that, it hasn't in 200 years since the Constitution of 1789. It has never been used once to say that an official act, which is what you need for speech or debate immunity, is helping someone plot a coup. That's just not within the constitutional protections. And so that's why he keeps losing and losing and losing. Again, he can try and bring this to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I don't think it's going anywhere.
Yamiche, every night we talk about January 6th, we talk about the Mar-A-Lago investigation, and we do it from New York. You do it from Washington. But you've been talking to voters in Florida, where Mar-A-Lago is actually located. Are people in the state of Florida locally, are they talking about these investigations?
It's an interesting question. I think if you're a Democrat who was already someone who was not going to be supporting Republicans who were very frustrated with former President Trump, who frankly some voters tell me want to see him go to jail, then you are paying attention to this. But when you're a Republican who's looking at this and sort of frustrated, even if you're frustrated with your party, they're not really talking about these investigations as a top thing. They're talking about inflation or abortion. I know some young Republican women have brought up abortion to me a number of times, saying that they think their party has gone a step too far on that issue. Of course, polls have shown that inflation is still the top concern for voters when you think about pocketbook issues and people just surviving. As someone who's from Florida, has a lot of family there, that is still, I think, the top issue for people. It's how do I feed my family? How do I put food on the table? And also sort of what are the politics in D.C. and all of these places, including Tallahassee? How are they bettering my lives? And for a lot of Floridians, Democrats and Republicans, they just don't know how their lives are being bettered by politics.
Well, there is the Inflation Reduction Law, which is going to take time for people to see the results, as well as the infrastructure law. They're just not doing it overnight. Things don't work that way. Neil, new government evidence has surfaced today at the Oath Keepers trial. I know there are so many things going on at once. Text from a very frustrated Oath Keepers leader, Stuart Rhodes, urging his members to get violent because he thought Trump himself wasn't doing enough to cling to power. At this point, how much more does the DOJ need to make their case?
I haven't been following it too closely, but everything I've seen so far suggests they don't need much stuff. I think this prosecution has been going incredibly well, unlike, say, the prosecutions brought by John Durham, which have fizzled, tremendously. But here, I think it looks like a very serious, well-done prosecution.
Neil, one that surprised me today, and we have to ask you. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she rejected a request that would block the Biden college debt relief plan. That was a surprise to me. You?
Not a surprise at all. This was a bogus lawsuit, Steph, every day of the week. I'm not surprised that Justice Barrett didn't even bother showing it to her colleagues and just deciding it herself. And the reason is that this lawsuit was just a political grievance. It had no special legal interest, no legal claim. The basic lawsuit was, hey, I'm a taxpayer and I don't like how this government money is being spent, which is not a legal claim. I think it was the comedian Demetri Martin who said, and I'll do this in a sanitized way, when someone begins a sentence, as a taxpayer, I believe, that person is going to be someone that you're generally not going to like.
Well, there you go. Yamiche Alcindor, Katie Benner, Neil Katyal. I wanted to talk longer, but in 40 minutes, Taylor Swift's new album drops, and I know Neil is positioned to download it, to listen to it, to dance to it, so we need to give him time to prepare. Ladies,
Absolutely.
Thank you all. Neil, enjoy T Swift. And before we go to break, we've got to update you on Elon Musk and his Twitter saga. The Washington Post got a hold of internal documents outlining what Musk says he will do if and when his takeover of the company goes through. And Twitter employees cannot be sleeping well tonight. The billionaire says he will fire almost 75% of Twitter's workforce. That is more than 5,000 jobs. The Post says that could potentially cripple Twitter's ability to combat misinformation, hate speech, and spam. And Bloomberg reporting tonight that the Biden administration and its officials are considering national security reviews for some of Musk's ventures, including the Twitter deal and his Starlink satellite network now being used in Ukraine. So stay tuned. We will be covering it all. When we come back from far-right conspiracy...
Did Joe Biden win the election, Congresswoman Green?
Joe Biden is the president of the United States.
Absolutely,
Marcus.
But you pushed a big lie that said he did not win the election.
There was election fraud.
You drove those people to the Capitol on January 6th with your lie.
We're going to move on. Josh Rowe, it's your turn to ask
and my
a question
husband has
to
the
Marjorie
proof of it.
She hadn't seen Frozen because Marjorie Taylor Greene won't let it go. And what's more concerning, neither will plenty other people in her party. The New York Times points out in a lengthy profile of the Georgia Congresswoman, writing this: every Republican candidate in her state and more across the country seem to be mimicking her. Not mocking her, mimicking her. With that in mind, we welcome back David Plouffe, former Obama campaign manager and senior advisor to the former president, and Mark McKinnon, former advisor to both George W. Bush and John McCain. He is one of the co-hosts of Showtime's The Circus, which has him in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district this very week. So, Mark, I must start with you. Spill it. What are people there telling you?
They love Marjorie Taylor Greene here. Everybody you talk to the more she is contentious, the more she gets in fights in Congress. That is one of the really interesting facts we found out is that when she got thrown off her committees, people saw that as affirmation of why they liked her. That's what they sent her. In their view, they want her to fight, they want her to break stuff, and they want her to basically throw a big middle finger to Washington. That's exactly what they're doing. And so I think the interesting thing... Yeah.
Fight for what? You just said it. She doesn't have a single committee assignment. You see her on TV all day, every day. I never talk about her on the show until now because she has absolutely no policy influence. So what is it that people are backing? She does nothing that improves their lives.
Well, Stephanie, that's about to change. If the Republicans take over Congress, which is likely, in the profile that you mentioned that Robert Draper wrote, which is terrific, it's very clear that she's talking about leadership positions in the Republican Congress. She's talking about getting an oversight position on the committee. Donald Trump is talking about putting her in his administration if he's elected. The whole point of this is that people, when she was knocked off the committees, you're right. She wasn't even taken seriously by most of her own party, but the party has moved to her now. And the party's become more like Marjorie Taylor Greene and less like Kevin McCarthy. And so the point is the next Congress is going to look a lot like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she is ascendant, and she is going to have a lot of power and influence. And she has a very clear legislative agenda.
Well, that's the next Congress if Republicans take power. David, what does that tell you about where America is? Because these lawmakers just follow what voters want.
Well, Stephanie, it should gravely concern us, because I don't think we're going to be out of the woods in terms of whether we're going to remain a democracy until the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, begin to recede in the Republican Party. And to Mark's point, I think they're growing. So, a healthy percentage of the people who are going to vote in Republican primaries, who donate, who volunteer, are going to support people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so that's what should scare us, which is until Republicans running for House, Senate, Governor, President, until more of them than not can say the person who gets the most votes should be the winner of an election. I believe in the rule of law. Don't believe the opposition party is filled with, Satanists and pedophilia, embracers. We're going to be in trouble. So that's where the energy of the party is. Listen, if Donald Trump doesn't run, I don't think it's out of the question that Marjorie Taylor Greene will run. Do I think she'll win the primary? Probably not. But she'll be a force from the get-go. And to your point about she's very policy light. I mean, I think her agenda will be to investigate the Biden administration. It won't be to help anybody through healthcare or the economy. But I think that is what is really driving. It's if you can become a frequent contributor on Newsmax, on Fox News, it's all performance right now. And the angrier you are and the more sort of out, to right field you are, the better you're going to be. And it's super scary. Because these are super scary times. But I think that's where the power is right now. And I agree with Mark. I think remarkably, she is now kind of, the Pied Piper for many in the Republican Party.
Well, it doesn't scare me or surprise me when voters who feel left out or forgotten or feel like the government never works for them. I understand why and when they back somebody who does want to give the middle finger to the establishment. But they're not the only ones. We've got billionaires like Ronald Lauder, mega rich New Yorkers, the Palm Beach set. He is just the latest rich guy to be dumping big, big money into groups that are supporting election deniers. What are these guys investing in, Mark?
Power, pure and simple. I mean, they are investing in what these are people who are used to betting on markets and where markets move, and they see voter markets moving toward a very fringe part of the Republican Party. I mean, they're looking at what's happened with Kerry Lake in Arizona. They're looking at what happened with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And these are people who rely on their business, and they make a lot of their money off of power and influence. That's what they care about at the end of the day. That's how they make money. And so they're looking to see who's going to be in power, and they're betting on it.
But here's why that doesn't make sense. Because people who spend their careers betting on markets, you have to bet on a market where you understand and you trust the framework and the rules. If you are voting against the preservation of democracy, you could turn around and live in a world where there is no rule of law. Do these business people not realize that? None of them invest in Russia for that very reason.
Well, I'd love for you to get Ron Lauder on the show and ask him that.
Me too. All right, David, we're keeping an eye on all these numbers all week, and these early voting numbers in Georgia are really big. What does that tell you?
Well, it all depends on who they are, Stephanie. We'll learn more about that as the experts dig into it. What you want to see in early vote, I'll just say as a Democrat, you want to see a lot of people that you weren't sure were going to vote. Because if it's just people who were going to vote on election day, but they vote early, it's great. You get the vote in the bank in case something happens. You want to see first-time voters, younger voters, voters that don't have a lot of history voting in midterm elections. So it's the composition of early vote that matters. But my suspicion is I don't know if we're going to reach 18 numbers. Those were historic, obviously, 2018 in terms of turnout. This is going to be a very strong turnout election. So, of course, if both parties are bringing all of their power to the polls, maybe neither party has a huge advantage from turnout. But if one party's able to get an advantage, that tends to make a big outsized difference in midterm elections. There's clearly a lot more energy on the left than we would have thought 6 or 8 months ago. I think one of the mistakes Democrats have made over the last 2 or 3 election cycles is underestimating Republican turnout. They are coming out. They're going to meet their numbers, is my view. So the question is can Democrats get close to that? And so it's fascinating to see who's going to be. But if you see a lot of first-time voters, a lot of younger voters, so everybody in America has a score in a campaign, right? 100 being they're going to support your candidate and 100 meaning they're going to vote. What you want to see, to get nerdy about it, is someone who's 100 on your support score, but 40 or 45 on turnout. You weren't sure they were going to turn out, and you got their vote in early. And that's what these campaigns are working so hard on right now, is to get those infrequent voters or first-time voters in the bank and early vote.
David, I appreciate you getting nerdy about it for us. Mark, on your show this week, you had a really compelling conversation with Tim Miller about how we got here. I want to share a bit of it.
There's this direct line from Palin and those monster truck rallies that she had. Tea Party, Trump, Kerry Lake.
So how did we get here, Mark?
Well, I mean, that discussion was, we talked about McCain and when McCain chose Palin, and of course, you know, that he had initially thought about appointing Joe Lieberman as his vice president as a dream ticket. And we talked about how different the direction of this country might have gone. But that was, I mean, it didn't start with Sarah Palin, it started with Newt Gingrich, and I mean, a lot of other factors leading to where we are today in the Republican Party. But the Palin decision was a real demarcation point, knocked a lot of other dominoes that fell. And Tim makes a good point that I think David was kind of making too, is that, you know, Palin could have been a campaign finance Palin, but she was reacting to the crowds at the time, and she kind of fed off the anger and bitter resentment that so many people had. And there's a lot of that out there today, and that's the kind of thing that's fueling a lot of the Republican candidacies and the Marjorie Taylor Greens that we see out there. Is that she's seeing the people. I'm talking to the people in the district, and I hear it, and I see it, and I've seen it this week. They're mad, and they see Marjorie Taylor Greene as somebody who will fight for them.
All right, then, David, Mark, thank you both for joining us. We will definitely see you again before the election.
Love it when Fluff nerds out.
I mean, when doesn't he? Let's be clear. I love when he qualifies it. I'm about to nerd out, as though he doesn't normally. Let's be honest.
Very true.
Good to see you both. Coming up, midterm politics in the president's home state. I'm talking about PA.
I said when I ran, we're going to build a country from the bottom up and the middle out, not the top down. When the middle does well, the wealthy do very well. So this law is about more than rebuilding our infrastructure. It's about rebuilding the middle class, something John knows a lot about and talks a lot about.
President Biden in the state of Pennsylvania today, stumping for Senate candidate John Fetterman. The president's visit comes just 19 days until the midterms, and Pennsylvania's all-important Senate race could end up determining the future of Biden's agenda. With us for more, my dear friend Elise Jordan, former aide in the George W. Bush White House and State Department. She's also an MSNBC political analyst and a contributor to Time Magazine. Elise, you went to Pennsylvania. You ran a number of focus groups, and you talked about all sorts of things: voter fraud, abortion, the economy. And I want to share a little bit of what you heard from some of these voters on the economy.
Will any of you vote specifically based on a politician's views on abortion?
No. Strictly no. If the choice is pro-life or pro-choice, and they're only pro-life with no other circumstance, I would never vote for them. So yes, I would make that decision solely on that, because that's a line I'm unwilling to cross.
I agree.
You know, you go to the grocery store and it's $130 and there's still no meat in the cart. It's hard to fathom that's where we are.
Yeah, everything costs more, but the pay is not getting higher.
That's it.
Nobody wants to do the real math.
People complain about the gas. That's the least of it. I mean, I can go 2 weeks without buying gas, but I can't go 2 weeks without buying milk, bread, things to eat at home.
Feels like a recession to me. Yeah. I remember the Great Recession, and that was a horrible time, and I'm really dreading seeing that again.
Yeah, I agree. Everything costs more, ridiculously more.
So here's the thing. Everything does cost more. And when people go to the store, they feel it every day. But the Biden administration has done a lot, right? When you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, it's going to lower healthcare costs, energy costs. It's going to address climate change. It's going to create better long-term jobs and make the tax system more fair. We know the infrastructure bill is going to create good jobs. The big problem, none of these things happen overnight, and certainly not in the next 20 days. So how problematic is that?
I think it's very problematic for Biden's political fortunes in these upcoming midterms, just because they're feeling the immediate hit and they aren't looking long term. What he did today, going to Pennsylvania, doing an event and touting rebuilding a bridge that was destroyed, that literally collapsed last year. He needs to be touting the work he's doing and reminding people that this is a job, this is rebuilding. Otherwise, you're going to hear from voters who just simply are fed up and they're going to vote accordingly.
Okay, but what are they voting for? Because I haven't heard one single policy proposal from any Republicans that are going to address any of those issues that those voters talked about. What are you going to do? Vote for a Republican and get Social Security reform? What are you going to get? Corporate tax cuts again? I mean, senior citizens who are facing higher prices, they're going to get a Social Security adjustment next year, up over 8% to account for inflation. Republicans love to cut that.
Something I heard this go round was so reminiscent of 2016, but you weren't just hearing it from Democrats or Republicans. You heard it from both groups. It's a choice of the lesser of two evils. That was exactly what people said about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump ad nauseum over and over and over. And it's how they were describing their Senate choices. Maybe they weren't that happy with John Fetterman, but they couldn't see themselves voting for Dr. Oz. At the end of the day, what am I going to do? Maybe I lean a little more Republican. Maybe I'll go with them. Maybe I'll decide that John Fetterman has recovered accordingly, and I'm going to go ahead and vote that direction. It really is the sliver of just the teensy 5% that are deciding the fate of democracy.
But did it seem like voters who want to vote Republican know what they're voting for? Or it's just voting against what they don't like, what they have right now?
A lot of voting against what they see as the current status quo, what they see as Biden policies that put a lot of money into the economy and cause the inflation. They see that. They see the spending, the COVID relief spending that Donald Trump did too, as coupling. The inflation message has been turned and pushed completely against Joe Biden.
All right, then. Elise Jordan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for that important focus group. We always say we're going to get out of New York, get out of D.C., and get on the ground. And that is exactly what she did. Coming up, she is now the short. British Prime Minister Liz Truss announced her resignation today. After just 44 days in office, even her own party had lost confidence in her. Our own Molly Hunter has more.
Truss's downfall was swift after the markets rejected her sweeping tax cuts, tanking the British pound, spiking mortgage rates. Inflation is now over 10%.
We just can't have this amount of turmoil.
The country is really, really in the shambles at the moment.
I'm actually embarrassed to be British at the moment and to be a Conservative voter.
And with a cold winter looming, the British people face a cost of living crisis, many just worried about heating their homes.
I've seen the effects of cost of living, firsthand, prices going up every day. It is incredibly unattainable.
With us for more, Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor for the Financial Times. Peter, get us up to speed, because Liz Truss isn't someone we talk about often here.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, she said she was in it, she was fighting, and then today she said, I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, literally, you could see the meltdown happening minute by minute, hour by hour. I mean, she seemed to, when she said that I'm not quitting in the Commons during the Prime Minister's questions, she kind of had saved the ship, and then one by one, all her senior aides, her ministers, the Home Secretary announced her resignation. She couldn't get the votes in Parliament for a confidence vote. She just, from day one, announced this economic plan that really saw the British economy melt down.
Okay, this is why people here should care.
Yeah.
It's her economic plan that sent everyone running for the hills. And why that should matter here is there's a whole lot of Republicans who love that economic plan. I want to share it. It was just a couple of weeks ago. Larry Kudlow was applauding her plans on Fox News. Watch this.
The new British Prime Minister Liz Truss has laid out a terrific supply-side economic growth plan, which looks a lot like the basic thrust of Kevin McCarthy's Commitment to America plan. Let's start with Truss. She is slashing tax rates and deregulating energy. I just love it.
He just loves it. That's Trump's former economic advisor saying her plan's a lot like Kevin McCarthy's. Should we be worried?
Yeah, look, they're two very different economies, right? I mean, the U.S. is an economy that relies very much on a domestic market. The U.K. is a trading nation. It needs the world to, particularly in its debt, it needs to finance its debt. That said, what we know about the global economy right now is there's never been higher debt levels in corporations and governments. Once you start seeing interest rates rise, and people can't pay off that debt. And that's what the Brits were running into. Suddenly, things begin to collapse. And that's what happened in the Eurozone crisis. That happened with the great financial crisis. It's that over-leverage in the global economy. Now, the problem in the UK in particular was...
Let me just tell our audience, when it's cheap to borrow, when rates are at zero, it's what everybody does. It's why we buy houses. It's why we start businesses. And when they raise rates to slow the economy, it makes it a hell of a lot more expensive for these companies to operate. Continue.
And there's that famous Warren Buffett line that no one knows who's swimming naked until the water goes out. And so what happened in Britain is
and
suddenly...
it's never anyone with a good body, just so you know.
That's true.
Never,
that's always
never
true.
is.
But what happened in Britain is suddenly the rates started raising, and oh my gosh, there's these over-leveraged pockets in pension funds that we didn't know existed before. And the markets began to freak out because where else are these unknown bits of leverage? And even in the U.S., people started looking, can we see similar things happening in the U.S. in terms of little pockets of danger that we don't know about? Because that's what caused the great financial crisis, right? These leverage, collateralized debt obligations. They didn't know that they were in the system. And that's what the danger is.
Let's go back to the U.K. because people are applauding this, saying they made a swift move. She was terrible. She's out. But we don't know what comes next.
Yeah.
So what chaos can ensue, and why is it so important to us? I mean, the UK, they're a very important ally.
Well, see, this is the issue which I think Americans need to pay attention to. Brits have been really distracted for almost a decade because of Brexit. And I remember I was in Brussels at the time, and a very senior American official came, the first Ukraine crisis, 2014, and almost was said the Brits are irrelevant. They're so distracted. An American said it's about our most important ally. They looked to Merkel, they looked to Germany in the first Ukraine crisis. What was happening in the last 6 months or so is suddenly the Brits were back, right? Boris Johnson started, Liz Truss took it on. They were really the backbone for the Europeans on Ukraine. Now you have the Europeans beginning to waver a bit. You have a new Italian government that is quasi pro-Putin. You have the French and the Germans fighting. The Brits were the ones that were backing the Americans on it. And suddenly we are going to have weeks, if not months, of inward-looking chaos. So when the Americans go and try to rally the Europeans to stand by Ukraine, their most important ally and our traditional ally for a century is now distracted and irrelevant. And that's very dangerous for the Biden administration. They're losing allies in this fight. And I think that coalition that's held together so well since February, we have to watch that.
It has been extraordinary. Before we go, I do want to ask you, the State Department says that the Iranian military was on the ground in Crimea helping the Russian military conduct strikes with Iranian drones. How concerned should we be?
Well, very concerned. I mean, to be honest with you, the fact that the Russians have to rely on the Iranians for drones tells you all you need to know about the state of the Russian military right now.
Bingo. And their economy.
And their economy. I mean, they don't have the munitions anymore. But it's interesting, it has begun to change the calculus, in Israel in particular. The Israelis have been very standoffish towards the Ukrainians. They were catering for the Russians, a big Russian population in Israel. Suddenly the Israelis have said, we have defensive systems, air systems. We are now giving it to the Ukrainians. So I think a lot of the calculations with American allies who may have been less prone to take a stand against the Russians now, when they see the Iranians coming in, they're going to be much more pro-American in this regard, I think.
Peter Spiegel, I love it when you come on this show.
Always a pleasure.
He is so smart and dynamic and entertaining. Great to see you. Thank you for being here. Coming up, the power of purple. Not just because it's a royal color.